had it not been for that German military operation that became successful in late 1917, we wouldn't have had a Soviet Union. We wouldn't have had a Cold War. We wouldn't have had a rise of Hitler.
Let's go.
Welcome to Citizen. We got a special guest today, Dr. J. Michael Waller, PhD in International Security Affairs from Boston University. You are a former PSYOPs instructor at the JFK Special Warfare Center at Bragg. I'm sure it's got some new name now, but I'm not playing that game. You're also an instructor at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. I almost went there, actually. Currently Senior Strategy Analyst at Center for Security Policy, D.C. Also an author. Latest book is Big Intel, How the CIA and FBI Went from Cold War Heroes to Deep State Villains. How's it going?
Great to be with you.
Yes, sir. And you were telling me that you grew up in New Hampshire.
Yeah, free state. It's a you'd never know it, surrounded by all of its neighbors, but it's a purple state. But even the liberals are not as nasty as they are elsewhere.
Sure, I've heard. Is it similar in Vermont? Because I've heard like there's a lot of hunters up there.
A lot of hunters up there, so you get sort of the hunter, redneck, lesbian vote, which sort of shapes Vermont, and then the University of Vermont town, which brings us Bernie Sanders.
Sure, that's a pretty interesting demographic there. I mean, why not? That sounds like old school libertarianism to me. Yeah,
it is.
So what was it like growing up there?
We can't tell the difference from socialism, though, when the politicians got elected.
Sure, of course. What was it like growing up in New Hampshire?
It was neat. It was a great place to grow up. It was even then it was a refuge for people fleeing New York and Massachusetts and Connecticut and elsewhere for the high taxes and the urbanization and everything. And unfortunately, most of those refugees brought their voting patterns with them. So it shaped the climate of the state, but there's still pretty much a leave me alone mentality for about 50-50 even, and a lot of crossover between parties. So it's a very unusual state. Growing up was cool though, because I got involved actually in an anti-nuclear movement when they were building a nuclear plant in the state, and that's what brought me in to be trained by professional communists from California. And then I realized I was being duped. So having been trained and become a dupe for several months in high school really made me see the world for what it was and see a lot of the activism and politics around for what it really is. And so I fully understand how well-meaning people can get pulled into movements run by very bad people to destroy our country.
Okay, you say that you saw politics and activism for what it really is. I agree. I worked in politics for just 1 year for the same reason. Well, actually, I did it intentionally just to see what it was all about, and I came to the same conclusion. I'm curious, when you say you saw it for what it really is, what is it really?
Well, there are really three kinds of politics. There's the good grassroots variety of citizen activism for what people really believe in. It's mostly sincere. It's not corporate. The towns in northern New England are run by what are called town meetings, where every adult in town is a town legislator. And once a year, we get together to the town meeting and we vote on different things and then direct the board of selectmen, who are selected by the people of the town, to execute what the voters want. And that's how the towns are run. So it's really, your honest citizen-based politics that's been the way it has been since American independence. And that hasn't changed a whole lot. Then you get the corporate side, so where you get sort of the uniparty type people who are funded by bigger interests. And then that's your second group. And then the last group is your really cynical militant side, where you have out-of-state people who are highly trained, who have no interest in the United States of America for what it is and want to fundamentally transform America. And they come in with their training, with their big money. They sue the small towns that can't afford to pay for litigation. They fund a lot of the militant politics, and they fund a lot of the media, and then they completely corrupt the local communities in terms of how their politics always was.
It seems to me just to be kind of affinity-based marketing at lower levels. So, and this has been the case all throughout human history. Governments have used this tactic, but you either create or identify some gripe people have. Sometimes, very frequently, governments create the gripe in the first place, but you come to the table with the only possible solution for it, right? So you identify the issue, you set the stakes, like, oh, democracy is going to end if we don't do X or whatever, and then you provide the only solution, and any other solution is disinformation, misinformation, so on and so forth. But really what you're doing is just trying to connect with the concerned citizen at their level and then exploit that concern. That's what it seems like to me. And it seems like that happens in every government forever.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what the outside groups come in and do. But the local groups, even if you have differences, like you'll see signs, because New Hampshire is a very political state because we have the first in the nation presidential primary. But we also have our House of Representatives, one representative for every 3,000 people. So there are 400 members of the state House of Representatives. So, you have politics all around you. And it's a part-time state legislature. So the representatives are only paid $200 a year because the idea is we don't want professional politicians running the state. And it's been that way since the 19th century. So it works out really well until the outside interests come in. And then they've got what you just noted was the affinity-based marketing, organizing on the college campuses, and then putting in a lot of money in a state where, it doesn't take much money to change things.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, look, Cambridge Analytica used the same strategy to win Trump the election in 2016. Everybody made all this hay about Russia spending $100,000 on Facebook, which, by the way, I was spending that at Black Rifle, I don't know, every week probably. So not effective as a strategy to spend that much during an election campaign. But what Cambridge Analytica did is the same thing that I personally think the left did in 2020, just in a more nefarious way. They identified a couple of counties throughout the country that if you win the election, right? Mostly in purple states, swing states as we call them. So if I can turn, these three counties in Ohio, I can win Ohio. So they did targeted advertising on Facebook before any of these privacy laws existed and just pumped these people full of Trump stuff all day long. And it worked, right? That's why, it's probably, I don't know when the next time we should expect to see a Republican presidential candidate win the popular vote. That may never happen. It's been rare for a while now that it happens, but that's not how we adjudicate presidential elections. So it's not really of any concern. It's a smart strategy. In 2020, it seems like the left did it by using ballot harvesters and things like that. And you can debate the ethics of that. You certainly cannot debate the efficacy of it because it certainly worked. Now, that low-level targeting is kind of what we've associated with grassroots over time. We used to think that it just happens naturally. I'm not sure that was ever the case. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there were elections where candidates got lucky, like, oh, this messaging just happened to hit with these people. But in the days of analytics that we're in now, that's never going to be the case, right? It's always going to be targeted.
Right. And then the demise of state and local newspapers and TV stations and stuff where it's not news that's generated by the communities, for the communities. It's now pumped in through, outsiders and algorithms and everything else. And what it's had an effect to set people against one another. So where you have, for example, in our town, a guy with a Trump sign in one yard, and then the next guy over has a rainbow BLM sign. And I talked to the Trump guy once, and I said, "So how do you two get along?" And they said, "We get along fine. We don't. It's just a sign. We don't care. We tap the same maple trees, and we have the same beehives. We just have different signs." And so it was always very neighborly, but that has begun to change, mainly because of the outside direct issue marketing.
Well, you've been at this for a very long time. 35 years or so in this industry, if you include your education days, a little bit more than that, actually.
45.
45, yeah, 45 now. If you include everything, if you include all the education, it's a long time. So, first of all, what made you get into this line of business in the first place? From your undergrad degree.
Yeah, so it was back in New Hampshire, actually, when I got involved in the anti-nuclear power movement. I was concerned because the power plant had a 6-foot pipe to bring the water from the cooling system of the reactor and pump it out to sea. And I went fishing, deep sea fishing with my dad and my grandpa, a lot. And I was really concerned this is going to kill the seabeds. And so that's why I got involved. And then, so it was pure environmental reasons and very local, very personal environmental reasons. But I was 15, 16 years old. And then finally they took a group of different groups of us from different high schools and isolated us. They took out the people who they thought had leadership potential. And then they did what I later learned was a struggle session that they put me through. And these were the California professionals who came in. And then they said, why do you want to be part of this? And I said, well, because I care about the environment. It's like, no, you don't. Why do you want to be part of this? And I kept saying it again. And they said, listen, we're here to overthrow American capitalism. That's why you're with us. And I said, no, that's not why I'm with you. So I quit. And then I thought, wow, I've been fooled into something. I better warn other people. So I got involved in this. And this was this was in the late 70s. So the 1980 election, when that came up, I realized, hey, there's something going on. So I get to meet a lot of the presidential candidates in 1980. Went to college in Washington, D.C. that year, George Washington University. Reagan was elected. I cast my ballot absentee for him. Had to show up at the town hall with voter ID at the time to register to vote absentee. And then it went off from there. I got a Senate internship, a very, very conservative senator and at the time there was a Soviet active measures campaigns going on to divide and disrupt our society. And some of the issues were nuclear power and then nuclear weapons modernization that President Reagan was promoting. And so I understood inherently from my personal experience what was happening. So I got involved that way in fighting it.
Mm. And as is the case, I suppose, when you're young, you kind of, your energy often gets co-opted by nonsensical stuff, right? I mean, I've experienced it quite a bit, actually. I was doing plainclothes security on Berkeley's campus during Occupy Wall Street. And just watching, I mean, it was, I sometimes tell the story of something very comical that happened. It's funny, but it's not funny. A guy I know who was an Oakland cop, who was a black dude that grew up in West Oakland, which is not the best place to grow up, by the way, if you don't know, was getting yelled at by this 19-year-old white trust fund kid that he was racist. I'm like, oh my God, we are in the intellectual Thunderdome now, folks, and everybody has just lost their minds. But yeah, you see that stuff all the time. It happens. And we've been gaslit so much. There's a couple of issues in particular, patriarchy, capitalism, and energy versus climate. I guess if you want to roll that all into one, are the things that I think we've been gaslit on the most. And it's really interesting to see like how easily duped we are. And I think it is something to do with high energy, high hope people. I don't think everybody always associates it with something negative, but I don't think it's negative. I think that it's a big mistake to listen to somebody who is pointing out a problem and dismiss them because you disagree with their solution to that problem, right? I think that's a huge mistake.
And question their motives.
Sure, yeah. This is why math teachers have you show your work, so they can look at the work and find out where you fucked up, right? Then you can go back and start correcting that process. Instead, we're just like, no, that's stupid bullshit. I'm not listening to that anymore. We have no desire to learn what our opposition really thinks. You know what I mean? We just want to entrench in our position and defeat them for some reason, which is the idea that you're defeating somebody in an idea contest is bananas to me, frankly. I mean, it should be a meritocracy. But one example of it is, one specific example that's outside of this purview, China has banned marijuana, right? Because they think it produces shiftless layabouts and it's harmful for a lot of different reasons, right? Not physically harmful necessarily. They don't care about that. They think it's socially harmful for people. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So in their country, they banned it. In the United States, they're funding marijuana grow houses all over the place, right? So what does that tell you? It tells you that if there's a foreign entity inside the U.S. propping up some kind of agenda or ideology, it is almost certainly bad for you. Like there's no, or at least from their perspective, right? They're not trying to do it. So I wonder from the energy debate specifically, and the 2000s and 2010s with Germany, especially. Like we've had our problems over here as well, but Germany may have hamstrung themselves more than any country has ever with regard to energy independence. They had 6 nuclear power facilities, which is still and will always be probably the at least in our this version of the American empire, will always be the most efficient and safe form of mass energy production. I don't think it's anywhere close with any other type until we figure out something with the sun and not having to dig lithium out of the ground. But they had 6 and closed 3 because of environmentalism. Then they closed another 2 because of environmentalism, and they had 1 left, and they were planning on closing that. And they're like, wait, let's not turn the lights off completely just yet. And luckily they didn't, because then this war in Russia kicks off, and their natural gas supply from Northern Europe, Russia, starts to dry up a little bit, and they're like, all right, cool, now we're kind of fucked, right? But this is all external influence. And it's interesting to me how obvious it was that people from the outside were influencing these energy decisions. Like anybody that's trying to tell you, coax you not to have your own stuff, not to be in control of your own life as a person or as a country or whatever, that person is trying to do something, right?
Yeah. They have their own, whether it's an economic agenda or a social agenda or a foreign agenda where that foreign entity means you harm. And so they're using people all the time. And when I later realized, so I first realized, okay, these were these real communists from the West Coast who came out here. They'd supported the Viet Cong, earlier. I later found out. So they're professional agitators for foreign hostile powers. They came in to organize us kids. We fell for it. And then, but I could see a lot of people who stuck with it out of sincerity, and they didn't want to see it that way. Or in their case, the people indoctrinating them weren't as blunt with them as they were with me, or they didn't react the same way. But when then you realize, you go on to see the big world, and you see foreign powers, which was the Soviet Union at the time, exploiting these movements in Western Europe and in the United States mostly. And you got to think, well, why are they doing it? And of course, it was one of many methods of taking us down. So messing with our energy supply, messing with our food supply, messing with our health. We don't even know the extent of and scope of foreign involvement in these campaigns today, because you don't have reliable entities tracking it like you did before.
And it's, we kind of think of this, I guess it depends on how in the know you are, how long you paid attention. But people have varying ideas about when this stuff started. A lot of people think it was the post-World War II era with, Marxism making its way into universities. Well, the Marxism part started long before World War II, but so did National Socialism. It was very prevalent in American university systems before the war. And it seems like it seems wildly crazy to me that this has been going on, that foreign infiltration information operations have been going on more or less in the open, right, for over 100 years now. And we're just like, no big whoop. People don't seem at all concerned about that. They seem concerned with Russia, which I don't personally, and we'll get to this at some point in a few minutes, but I think Russia is often propped up as a paper tiger for us to have somebody to go fight with when it's convenient for the military-industrial complex. But we worry a lot about Russia and not about all of the information warfare and electronic warfare that comes from China, which is our prime issue in the global sense. And it's like, what's your sense of what the average person in America knows about this stuff? Why do they not know that this is going on, or why do they not care?
It's always been the case where the average person's just leading their normal lives, and this doesn't relate to them in their day-to-day lives, and they don't look really beyond their local communities or local interests anyway. So that's always been an issue. But if you look back in our history and look at George Washington's farewell address, we always hear the part about no entangling alliances, but he wrote a lot about foreign subversion. He was talking about then British subversion to destroy our new republic, to destroy our unity as a nation of independent, sovereign states. And that was the real message of his farewell address. Wasn't so much foreign alliances as you're going to be subverted from within, and that's what you have to watch against. And you have the years leading up to the Civil War was the same. You had a lot of British influence supporting the South because that was the source of cotton for the British textile industries in Manchester and elsewhere. They wanted that reliable and cheap cotton. And then you had this foreign influence always as a factor of ours. We got into World War I because of foreign influence, because the British had broken the German diplomatic code and found they were desperate to get us involved in their war. Europe, it wasn't our war in Europe. It was just a traditional European war between empires. And as far as we were concerned, there were no real good or bad guys. We weren't favorable to the British. We didn't have a problem with the Germans. German-speaking Americans were the second largest, ethnic group in the United States, cultural group in the United States. So we had an affinity with Germany, and we had a sort of an affinity and antipathy toward the British. So it wasn't our war. But what did the British do? They had their deepest of secrets, which was the fact that they could break the enemy's codes. You never reveal that. But they decided to reveal that as a last-ditch effort to drag us into their fight through the Zimmerman telegram. When Foreign Minister Zimmerman had a telegram to his ambassador in Mexico saying, Germany will make peace with Japan, and then we in Japan will join you, Mexico, to help you invade the southern United States to get back Texas and New Mexico and Arizona. And it was revealing that Zimmerman telegram that gave President Wilson the excuse that he sort of wanted, even though he said he'd keep us out of the war, to get involved to fight that war in Europe. So that was a foreign influence operation. And then you had, as you pointed out, the Marxists and the National Socialists, which not just predated World War II, but Marxists and anarchists had been coming into our country since the late 1800s with these big waves of immigration. So they're bringing in these foreign ideologies that had nothing to do with our American founding, and they were assassinating mayors and politicians, and they assassinated President McKinley, and so forth. And so it went from the low-level propaganda to high-level assassinations and everything else in between. That's one of the reasons that the FBI was created, was to combat this wave of subversion.
Sure. Do you think it was, I guess in the end, was it a mistake for the U.S. to get involved in World War I?
It wasn't really in our interests. So, the Germans were not our enemy. So they had a plan to subvert us because they were fighting a war in Europe, but they didn't do that. Really, the British dragged us into that war. And I don't know what we gained from it, except to have Woodrow Wilson, right, the Princeton University professor, demand unconditional surrender to humiliate the Germans and to destroy Germany as a country and leave it full of such resentment and so polarized that the Bolsheviks could come in and the National Socialists of Hitler could organize and play on that anger and polarization and humiliation and tear out the broad center of Germany, which was really one of the most civilized countries in all of Europe, and to become what it became under Hitler.
And one of the ways that, warfare and diplomacy, people see as opposite ends of the spectrum, but they're really complements to one another, right? I mean, throughout all of human history, there have been cases where foreign invaders have been repelled and then chased back to their homes and annihilated, and the ground razed and salted, blah, blah, blah. But it's very uncommon, right? I mean, Carthage attacked Rome for hundreds of years, right? And generally speaking, they would find some kind of settlement at some point and they would go back home or whatever. And that was kind of the standard for warfare, right?
And you'd become good neighbors again in most cases.
Very frequently, right? So for some reason, I don't know if it was petulance. I mean, the people that were in charge, Victoria's nephews, I guess, who were in charge of three major countries during that time, all seemed to be imbeciles, right? So maybe it was just that. Maybe it was incompetence. I believe in Hanlon's razor. But it sure opened the door. I mean, not giving somebody a gracious exit sure opened the door for a lot of the stuff that happened in the 30s and 40s, and it seemed like a huge mistake on our part to be anywhere near any of that stuff.
And we don't learn these lessons either. So you had the unconditional surrender to completely destroy Germany as a country. When that had been yes, there was a destabilizing factor that started World War I, but that was because of all the different families of different monarchies related to one another. That wasn't real nation state. That was royal family rivalries. But then you had the Bolsheviks took advantage of the Russians being involved in the war. And you had, they were allied with the British against the Germans, and then you had the necessity for the Germans. If you think about it, really, the Bolshevik Revolution was a German military operation. So it was the German General Staff and Deutsche Bank that got together and told Lenin and his group, hey, come out of Switzerland. We will meet you. We will fund your revolution. We'll send you on the sealed train to St. Petersburg. And as long as you promise to overthrow the government and get Russia out of the war. To ease up on our German Eastern Front. So Lenin was fine with that. So it was really the German Kaiser's government who helped overthrow the socialist government that had overthrown the Tsar in Russia. Mm. So had it not been for that German military operation of early 1917 that became successful in late 1917, we wouldn't have had a Soviet Union. We wouldn't have had a Cold War. We wouldn't have had a rise of Hitler.
We would have had a Russian state that was just as bruised and battered as the German state, instead of being our chief competitor and a second superpower, right?
Yeah. And a Western-oriented, social democracy like much of the rest of Europe became.
Sure, yeah. I mean, we think of the Soviet Empire a lot differently than we do of mainland or Western Europe, but Western Europe is pretty socialist. You know what I mean? By our standards, at least. You say we don't learn those lessons well. Yeah, we kind of did the same thing in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Like going into a country that has 25, 50, 80 million people and cutting the head off the snake, as we like to say. In reality, it doesn't kill the body. And the body just goes ape shit, and everybody takes turns being the head of the snake for a while. I don't know why a lot of people are very critical, and rightly so, of the Iraq invasion. Personally, I had a pretty good time over there, to be honest, but a lot of people didn't, and it was a huge waste of lives and taxpayer dollars. But not enough people are critical of the Afghan war, in my opinion. Like that, we were not. The Taliban was the government there, right, for all intents and purposes. And we decided to deploy tens of thousands of people there to fight the Taliban for 20 years. Why? Right? Like we make a deal with them to murder all of Al-Qaeda, or just tell us where they are and we'll drop bombs on them and we'll come clean up the mess. But we're not going to come invade your country and bring in an outsider to run it like that. Why did we think that was going to work?
Right. There was so much money involved in this, and so much of an ideology in the belief that it's our mission as Americans to remake the world in our image, and we can bring human rights and feminism to Afghanistan along with the clean water and whatever else and make it a democracy. Like really idiotic thinking, but that became the pervasive line of thought where among the military planners at the Pentagon after 9/11, it was go in, wipe out the enemy, job done. And instead, to build bipartisan consensus and everything else, you had this huge, not just military industrial complex, but humanitarian aid industrial complex and the democracy industrial complex and other social industrial complex to go in and bring a social revolution into Afghanistan at the point of American guns and the cost of our lives. Meanwhile, what do we do with Iran, which is a big problem that nobody wanted to talk about? We've surrounded Iran now on both sides, in Iraq to the west and Afghanistan to the east. What, of course, are the mullahs going to be thinking? They're going to be thinking, first, the United States has us in a pincers movement, and we're next, which they never were. And so, therefore, we have to kill as many Americans indirectly with IEDs and all sorts of other IRGC Revolutionary Guard activity and not pay any price for it, because of course the U.S. made the Iranian regime pay no price for killing and maiming all our people with IEDs. So then you have them the Iranians in a situation where they perceive us as a mortal enemy, which we were not. They misperceived our intent, and then of course you have all these second and third order effects coming after it, which we're still paying for today.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, here's the thing: like in Iraq, most standing armies of countries, especially countries that were run like Iraq, once the top 2 or 3 levels of leaders are gone, you don't destroy the army and make everybody your enemy. You don't destroy the Mukhabarat secret police and make it your enemy and destroy all the archives and agent networks that it had. You take them over and you make them work for you. And so with very little money, we could have gone in a proconsul type of role with a small amount of troops and with a lot of money and say, you guys are working for us now. We'll make sure you get paid. We'll make sure you keep your respect. We'll make sure you keep your family honor, as long as you help us fight the jihadis and fight the Iranian regime, because no one was better than Saddam Hussein's regime with agent networks inside Iran and then defensive networks against Iranian subversion in Iraq. So it would have been a great plan, but the military, they don't think that way, especially the leadership.
Sure, and it seems like, I know this for a fact, that the State Department and agency have taken a greater role in the prosecution of military affairs over the past 20 years for some reason. It happened in Iraq. Some of the first people deployed to Iraq were actually Intel DS guys or DSS guys from the State Department. Once Turkey shut down our airspace, my unit, the 82nd, we were going to jump in, fly out of Saudi Arabia, go through Turkish airspace, jump in, pincer Baghdad, right? That was the goal. Marine Corps was going to come in with tanks. We were going to come from the north with link up with the Peshmerga and go south. That was the plan. Turkey says, no, you can't use our airspace. So the State Department infills a bunch of DSS guys to start working with those Peshmerga guys, with the fighters up there that had been gassed several years prior. That seems weird to me. You can advance that all the way to the Afghanistan withdrawal in 2021. The State Department was the agency in control on the ground of that. That is fucking crazy to me. They have no idea what they're doing. Not one idea. They have literally, and he wasn't a good one. The guy's kind of a piece of shit, but they had an 82nd Airborne Brigade commander who trains constantly for this specific thing, for seizing an airfield, controlling it, and then getting people the fuck out. That's what he does. That's literally his specialty. And instead, they brought the State Department in to run that. I don't understand it. So what do you know about this conversion from trust and military command? Because we all know about Wild Bill Donovan. But in World War II, it was the generals who were in control. And in Korea, it was the generals who were in control. But at some point, it changed. And I don't know when it changed. Maybe it was with MACV-SOG and the whole Vietnam situation that lasted 20 years as well. I don't know. But where did you see this change?
So we saw it change really when there was no more congressional declaration of war. So you had no more state of war. So then it became a legal marshland, a wasteland of laws, and you had lawyers taking over. So it wasn't just State Department taking over, so it was lawyers. So you might have had this experience yourself where you would have either a JAG or a civilian lawyer saying yes or no, you can or cannot fire on this guy. Sure. And, it's very tactical situations. It's insane. It was unheard of in our whole history, because in a state of war, the military has complete authorization to do whatever it needs, as long as it's okay with the president. But you don't have it in situations where we're not officially in a state of war anymore. And then it's the rise of lawyers in general taking over all aspects of society.
Yeah, that's what, for those of you who know the name, Kash Patel did when he was assigned to the U.S. military as member of the Department of Defense. That essentially any kinetic unit is going to have a JAG that sets rules of engagement, either in a large scale or sometimes even down to the individual targeting package. Like we have a package on one dude specifically that we're going after. Here's what you can and can't do to bring him in or kill him, right? I can't imagine that was the case in World War II. It was like, oh, there's Nazis over there. Let's go fucking cut their heads off. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, you had 17-year-olds, as commissioned officers at that time. giving the commands for it. So they didn't mess around. It's like, go kill the Nazis, wipe them out.
Now, the State Department is always, I guess, not always, but for a long time is engaged in subterfuge to some degree. But their chief responsibility is diplomacy. And now it seems like it's very difficult to tell the difference between state and agency at this point. I can't tell the difference. I have friends who, well, actually, my last friend is leaving service right now, but I've had friends in both for the last 20 years, and I can't tell the difference in their job descriptions.
And that's really dangerous, too, because you have diplomatic protections that intelligence officers don't have. And you can build relations of trust among countries knowing that a diplomat is a diplomat and he will speak diplomatically with his fellow diplomats. And so they can come to agreements on things with a confidence that there's no real subterfuge there. But once you have the distinction blurred so that no one can tell an intelligence officer from a diplomat, or even today's situation now where the director of the CIA is acting as America's top diplomat in the Middle East and Russia on many situations. He's eclipsed the Secretary of State. You've got a very dangerous line here where diplomacy and intelligence are so gray that there's no difference. And in international law, you have, spies do not have the protections diplomats have. Just, like as with the military, they don't have certain protections. So this is a very dangerous world that we've gotten into. But it's really gotten that way since the CIA was founded, when they used embassies as diplomatic cover for intelligence, either collection officers or operations officers. It was important for us to do, and it succeeded in our interests. But at the same time, because we had not changed the policy set in 1947 to so in 2024, it's the exact same policy. And in a very different world, you've got this gray area now where diplomacy and intelligence are almost indistinguishable from one another.
Yeah, and now we're getting into it, right? I mean, we've been in, I think celebrating the end of the Cold War in the early 90s was kind of like spiking the football in the third quarter, to be honest. I mean, we had the assumption that all this was going to go away, and I think you actually did some postgraduate work, if I'm not mistaken. I was reading some of your stuff over the weekend, some postgraduate work in the KGB, essentially taking over Russia post Cold War, and then handing over power, I guess, to the oligarchs. I'm not sure exactly how all that went, to be honest. I just know they have a lot of power, but
yeah, it was
yes.
Close enough. Yeah, my graduate work was at Boston University, where I was working. I wrote my master's thesis on disinformation, and my professor was actually a former Soviet bloc intelligence officer he brought us the term disinformation in the United States and introduced it to our lexicon. And it's very different from the word you hear thrown about today. It's a KGB intelligence term that has now entered American vocabulary as a political jargon, and it defeats the whole understanding of what disinformation really is. But then when I went on to get my PhD program, I was monitoring the Soviet press. So it was the military press that was for the military, and then the KGB's own press and its own statements. So they had to communicate with each other somehow, and so they couldn't. Not everything was a lie. Although it was the Soviet system, so a lot was lies. But what I was able to do was track how under Gorbachev, with his reforms of glasnost and perestroika, which we all took at face value, what Gorbachev was really doing was to try to save the Soviet Union and save the KGB secret police and its whole global spy apparatus that propped up that whole system. And so I was watching that, and then went over to Moscow right before the Soviet collapse and was working with Russians and Ukrainians who were trying to take a hammer to the USSR. So I got to be in the Kremlin the day the Soviet Union was broken apart, and it was a very exciting time to be there, because then you had a lot of human rights activists and journalists and others you could buy whatever you wanted from the KGB people because they didn't know what was going to happen to them. And so we got bags and bags and bags of internal documents, a whole lot of fantastic material. So it was an intelligence collection, dream, but there was at the same time a huge opportunity for the United States to exploit the situation to our advantage and to pull out the KGB from the roots. Because Russian President Boris Yeltsin at the time was in the mood to do such a thing. He was in a vengeful mood, but he also needed the internal security parts of the KGB to keep himself in power. So we could have cut some great deals with him, but we didn't have an imaginative enough intelligence leadership in the United States or a policy leadership, whether that was President George H.W. Bush and his main person handling this, Condoleezza Rice, or the Clinton team that came in right afterward. So instead, what they did in the name of stability was to preserve the KGB intact. Now, it had been divided into different organizations and under different names, but it was still the same network and the same bureaucratic culture and the same archives. So we never had a demand to the Soviets when they were depending on us for their economic survival, or to the post-Soviet Russians. Never said, we'll help you as long as you stand down your operations against us and uproot your agent networks against us, and you decommunize just the way the Germans denazified, and we'll help you through it, but in a friendlier fashion. That never happened. So I was documenting all of this the whole time. But what did you have in that network of networks that we never demanded be uprooted? You had the whole Soviet support network for international terrorism. The Soviets created the PLO. They created the Palestine militant nationalist movements. They helped create the Iranian mullah regime, the mullahs were trained at Patrice Lumumba University in Russia. They could have handed that to us, and Boris Yeltsin, president of Russia at the time, would have done so had we imposed those conditions on him. But neither Bush nor Clinton wanted to do that.
That's very bizarre to me. I mean, it felt like a good, and that's the second time something like that had happened within a course, let's say, of 25 years, because in the same way that we had an opportunity to modernize and befriend Russia in a lot of ways, we could have modernized and befriended Iran in the 70s, right? I think, and if my memory serves, they wanted a better OPEC deal, right? They wanted to shed themselves any of the Western influence. I believe they kicked, was it Amoco or one of the companies they kicked down?
British.
Yeah, the British Iranian oil company. They dissolved that and they kicked Amoco, I think, out of the country. But if you looked around Iran at the time, everybody seemed to be, this is in the 60s, I guess, but everybody seemed to be pretty Western. They were looking pretty Western. It wasn't run by religious fanatics just yet. And we had an opportunity there and didn't do a great job with that. And then shortly after, we get into this era, like we defeat Russia in a lot of ways, and have an opportunity to be influential in reshaping it. And for some reason, like you say, it's just garden variety uncreativity and incompetence. That is hard to accept, to be honest. As somebody who's watched it happen over and over again as a student of history, how do you accept that it's just incompetence and not something a little bit more nefarious? Like, we need enemies, so.
Oh no, I just was summarizing fast so as not to talk too much. There's a lot more to it, but we can never underestimate incompetence and bureaucratic timidity and a lack of imagination. So, for example, in George H.W. Bush's administration, and I was working with some of the people in there as an outside, very young scholar, but saying, hey, this is what I'm seeing over in Moscow. This is something you ought to know. They were literally afraid of the collapse of the Soviet Union. They dreaded it. They were much more comfortable with what they knew. They didn't want to collapse the Soviet Communist Party. Reagan had wanted to, and people behind Reagan had wanted to. And so those were the people on the private sector who were supporting my work, because I was doing not just scholarly work, but activist work to uproot these networks, having been involved earlier in Central America with the Contras in Nicaragua and then the counterinsurgency in El Salvador. And in that case, too, the State Department did not want to win those conflicts. It didn't want the Nicaraguan peasant army to overthrow the Sandinistas and establish a pro-American government. It did not want the Salvadoran army to destroy the Soviet-backed communist insurgents. It wanted to let everybody win or let the other side win, or in the case of the Contras, who I worked with. So I quit Army ROTC before going to basic training, and I did my basic training down with the Contras in Nicaragua as an insurgent when I was a kid. So I saw all of this up close. There was no intention on the U.S. side, for the Contras to win once the George Bush 41 government took over. They wanted to just wash their hands of all of that. And even the Salvadorans could have crushed the communist insurgency there. And I was right there with them. The U.S. forced the Salvadorans to accept a negotiated settlement to allow the communist guerrillas to come in and to participate in society unscathed. No war crimes, no justice, no nothing, just bring them all in. So then you still have now, Daniel Ortega was in power in 1979. He's still in power today in 2024. And this is all part of that State Department mentality of negotiated settlements on terms unfavorable to us. And then you have other parts too. The Central American countries were too small for military industries to make anything, but there was a vested interest in keeping a post-World War II, early Cold War military posture. So our entire military posture of today, with exceptions for the counterterrorism changes after 9/11, is still a Cold War military posture where our whole Navy, our whole Air Force are built for, on designs from the 1950s. They've been changed and modified here and there, but it is nothing at all reflective of today's political and military realities. And so even the counterterrorism part of the fight, when I had gone, because I was working with the Office of the Secretary of Defense right after 9/11 as a privately funded outsider, and nobody knew anybody with insurgent experience. And I said, well, I was part of an insurgent army for several years back in the 80s. I can help. And they said, no, you spoke Spanish. You don't speak Arabic. We can't use your help. So they had this mentality. Well, I said, they don't speak Arabic in Afghanistan either. So, I mean, what are you talking about? So then I was working on the low-cost, high-impact solutions to this. You can psyop these guys. If you understand the culture, let's bring in hard-nosed people who really understand the culture. And how do you use pride and shame and all the other aspects of their culture to bring them out? And we developed a whole lot of psyop ideas, some of which were tried, and some of those were very successful. But no, the thing is, let's go in for the big military, very high expense, relatively low result design that we have, and then put in, I don't know how many generals in charge of it. But I mean, if you even look at the vaunted, counterinsurgency manual of the mid-2000s that Petraeus's team put together, they barely mention PSYOP at all. You can't become a general officer if you're a PSYOPer in that MOS. So there's no constituency for inexpensive PSYOP that can be done really well, which we don't do well, because there's no money in it.
Well, that's always the case, right? I mean, it sounds to me like we are convinced we're playing chess on the global stage, and we are barely playing checkers. That's what it seems like to me. Like a lot of, I remember reading Kissinger say that it's a shame that both sides couldn't lose in the Iran-Iraq situation, right? Just because we didn't care about Iraq so much, we just wanted to degrade Iran as much as we could. It's like, all right, cool, man. I mean, I think the agency coined the phrase blowback. They know what it is. They invented that shit. And it's just been, man, it's like taking a pill for something and then having to take 4 more pills for the side effects. And at what point does it become too much? And George Shultz was no stranger to this either, Reagan's Secretary of State. I mean, it was disastrous to some degree, not then, but later on with some of the stuff they pulled. So let's get back to, I want to talk more about the book, though, because this is all kind of circling around it. The byline, or not the byline, excuse me, the first line of the description says, Big Intel recounts the dramatic story of the rise in Cold War heroics of the FBI and the American intelligence apparatus, followed by its unfortunate slide into Marxist-influenced deep state dysfunction as Big Intel became bad intel. When you say Marxist influence, is that in the same way that young college kids are influenced, or is it something different with the State Department and the intelligence community?
Well, just about everybody in the State Department and intelligence community had been young college kids at one time. And so what you have here, if you see what's happened to the military, for example, and all the weird stuff that's been going on there, and it's driving out a lot of people, and bringing a lot of people who shouldn't be in the military, and then policies that certainly aren't in our interests. You have the same thing that's going on in the CIA, much of the rest of the intelligence community, and then more recently the FBI. And that is where they have subscribed to these ideologies that were brought in that we talked about much earlier, brought in by refugees and others from Central Europe who had had Marxist-based views of the world, so nothing to do with American founding principles, zero to do with that or the Reformation or anything like that, but it's fundamentally anti-Western civilizational principles. They were kicked out of Europe because they subscribed to those principles and were trying to overthrow the established order, or they simply decided to escape to America, which would welcome them. And we didn't vet these people for those types of ideologies. We just took them for who they were to build our country. But when they started penetrating our educational system in the 1920s and 30s, and they came for the purpose of doing so, especially this group in Germany called the Frankfurt School, which had been founded by the Soviets in 1924, by the Bolsheviks and by the head of the Bolshevik secret police, Felix Dzerzhinsky, for this explicit purpose of finding ways to subvert and soften up and destroy Western societies from within, because a Bolshevik-type revolution couldn't be replicated in the Western country. The working class had too much hope or too much upwardly mobile opportunity. And so you couldn't get that unrest that they wanted. So what they did was they started in Weimar, Germany, unconditional surrender Germany. The society was destroyed. Their sense of nationhood was shattered. The sense of their very proud traditions were shattered. And so you had everyone from the monarchists and the conservative Christians, both Catholic and Lutheran on one side, and then the moderates and socialists, and then various degrees of national socialists and international socialists on the other side. And the idea of the Soviets was, let's polarize this very fragile society in Germany to cause it to collapse from within. And then we'll come in and pick up the pieces. So that was the whole object of what the Frankfurt School was for. So it wasn't just to destroy patriotism, national pride, national honor, and not just the church, but all of the moral foundations and then the legal traditions on which those moral foundations are based, and then the nuclear family unit, all of those things, to wreck it all and cause it all to collapse. So when you had the Frankfurt School people starting out at Columbia University and then spreading out through teachers' colleges and other universities across the country, by the 1950s, they had developed critical theory. And they gave that critical theory of relentlessly criticizing all aspects of society and culture, not to improve it, but to tear it apart and destroy it fundamentally, and then build something in its place. That was the nexus of critical theory. So they were combining the early Karl Marx. This was the pre-communist manifesto Karl Marx. Mm-hmm. Before he wrote Das Kapital also, he was writing about social commentary and making war on culture. And then that didn't catch on, so he said, let's make a war on the economy with the working class versus the wealthy bourgeoisie. That became replicated. So out of Columbia University came this ideology that gave then the new left. So this is the social unrest of the late 50s and the 60s, especially on the campuses and also in the inner city. But it didn't have ideological coherence. And if you don't have ideological coherence, you can't have structural coherence, and you can't attempt to take something over if you don't have that coherence. So it was these critical theorists led by Herbert Marcuse and others who came in to give it that critical, that coherence. And so that was what became then critical race theory, critical law theory, where everyone's the victim and we have to fight the oppressor, and it's all a common oppressor, which is not just the American government, because the American government can be taken over, but American founding traditions. That's why you have this pull away from our constitutional beliefs that had united everybody in America before, regardless, liberal or conservative or whatever, and to tear that apart. And then critical gender theory, and then everything that comes beyond that. So now the society's in the mess that it's in. But you can all trace that back to that meeting in 1924. Now, Herbert Marcuse, what did he do? He went into the OSS during World War II, like a lot of communist agents and other communists did. They wanted to end the war on Soviet terms, but they went in to become the core of our World War II intelligence community, and many of them went into the State Department after the war. FBI was a harder target, and that didn't go soft until the past 20 years or so. And so we have what we have today.
It comes up a lot that in the debates we have about immigration, that immigration has historically been a positive thing, and that is true to a large degree, right? I mean, the importation of cheap labor and then the assimilation of people into a culture that increases tax base is typically a good thing, right? I mean, think of it as seeds falling from a tree and new trees growing, but the standard then was assimilation into our culture. And now that is not the standard. The standard now is to come here, build your own community, and put somebody that looks like you in Congress, which is fucking crazy that we would allow that, to be honest. So what do you think about, excuse me, like how vigorously should we be defending our culture? But when I say our culture, I mean founding principles in America, because censorship and authoritarianism against ideas, like you're not going to see American agents aren't going to make their way into the Russian education system and teach them that this and this is bad, right? Because Russian agents will just show up and fuck them up, right? Now, that's not what I want. It's not the kind of country I want to live in, frankly. Like that, I just don't want to have agents of the state showing up and arresting people for the ideas they have. I think that's a really bad idea. And I think most people would be pretty uncomfortable. Well, before COVID, I would have thought most people would be uncomfortable with that. Now I'm not so sure. Maybe half of people would be uncomfortable with that. But the question is, how vigorously do we need to defend our culture from this nonsense?
We need to do it very vigorously, and it has nothing to do with ethnicity or race or anything. It has to do with the American idea, and even if that American idea was practiced very imperfectly by many of the founders, that was still the goal. That's toward a more perfect union. But if you look back at American founding principles, it's readily understandable. All these goals are equality for everybody under the law. But in a country where people share the same basic values on which our laws and rules of procedure are based, government by the consent of the governed, and the right of the governed to remove their government through elections. But even the Constitution itself says there are orderly ways. If we don't like our form of government, we can change the whole form of government in an orderly way. So what you had with large waves of immigration coming in, most of the people benefited our society, especially the second generation of them, when they could really come in and assimilate. They sought to become Americans. And you had Americanization schools, and you had newcomers were taught to speak English. And even if the older people couldn't really learn it well, or were just too busy working to be able to learn it, the kids always learned it, and then they went on to become really productive citizens. The change came when all of a sudden the American system had to accommodate these newcomers, and whether they came in legally or illegally. So you have a lot of critics saying, well, look at all these people criticizing immigration. What about the great waves of immigration in late 1800s to the 1920s and Ellis Island? Well, the whole purpose of having Ellis Island in New York Harbor and these other places was to process immigrants and screen them so that they could immigrate here illegally. And the ones who would be damaging to our country, whether they had a disease that was communicable, or they had a criminal record, or if they were revolutionaries, they'd be sent back. So a decent percentage of immigrants through Ellis Island were sent back to their home countries. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the way it's always been. That's what legal immigration is for. But when you abandon that, saying you can't have Americanization anymore. It used to be in the naturalization process, there was called Americanization. That was done away with because that's bad. That's offensive. And so now people are being brought in. I mean, imagine my father-in-law was from El Salvador. He died waiting to get his American citizenship. He was an engineer, a construction engineer, a productive guy, but he Meanwhile, it burned him up to see people coming over illegally and then living off his taxes that he was paying as a legal resident. He was part of he had equipment that he supplied to construct Epcot Center at Disney World in Florida, one of many small businessmen working on that project. So, productive guy. So then you have these unproductive or these troublesome people come in, or you have with the sanctuary movement from El Salvador, families of the communist guerrillas and the guerrillas themselves demobilizing and coming up to live in the United States without being screened at all. This is where MS-13 comes from. And so we end up importing these criminal gangs and murderers and cartels and everything else with no screening. And this was never part of the American experiment. And somehow it's become it, and those folks have greater rights than people who are here legally.
Yeah. I want to go back to Russia for a minute because they've been a chief adversary of ours for some time now, longer than we realized it, apparently, right? I mean, stoking all the nonsense in Germany in the early part of the 20th century was very unhelpful to the world. They created a monster that killed quite a few of them, as a matter of fact. What should, at this point in American history, how should we be handling Russia? Do we need to break their back again so we can get capitulations like we should have from Yeltsin, or should we isolate it? What should we be doing here?
Well, we really blew it early on. And so we can't undo what we've already done, but we can learn, is it in our strategic interests to paint a nuclear target on all of us for Ukraine? I support Ukraine's right to self-defense. I think it has a just right to self-defense, and Russia was an unjust aggressor. But Ukraine is not a military ally. So where is it in our interest to help Ukraine, and where is it in our interests not to help Ukraine? Where do you divide the line? Do we send ATACMS there to have the Pentagon authorize Ukrainian attacks on Russian military sites inside what Russia considers its own territory? Is it in our interest to do that? We haven't even had a national debate about this, and you haven't had the President of the United States present a strategy to Congress or the public or anybody else about where do our national vital interests stop. So what they've done instead is they've put Putin into a box, or what they perceive as a box, to try to humiliate him, to try to destroy his economy. Instead of dividing the oligarchs against him, it imposed sanctions on all the oligarchs there. And instead of taking advantage of the many factions supporting Putin, it united those factions around Putin. And then at the same time, you have a worse adversary, Communist Party of China, where Xi Jinping is still consolidating the last parts of his power that he hadn't consolidated. And what have we done? We've pushed Putin and Xi Jinping together. And oh, by the way, now, North Korea. So just this week, Russia has signed a mutual self-defense treaty with North Korea. So what have we done over this Ukraine strategy? We've made Putin stronger. We've made the Russian government stronger as an adversary against us. So now we've got a fleet 26 miles off Miami, a Russian fleet. How does that benefit us?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why it sounds like throughout this whole process, we've had multiple opportunities to quell it, including before it ever started. At least if you believe people in the NatSec community.
Yeah.
Which I sometimes do. I guess it depends on if it's attached to not spending money. I usually believe them, right? Because now Zelensky has overstayed his term, right, by about a month and a half. Actually, I think month and a week. So his presidential term is over now, but he's suspended elections. That's usually not a good sign. It's usually not a good sign that somebody's canceling opposition television and news agencies. Usually not a good sign if he's arresting political opponents. But for some reason, this feels a lot like propping up Iraq versus Iran again. Although we're not also funding Russia, I don't think. Maybe we are buying some of their stuff, but we're not sending them weapons like we did to Iran during the Iran-Iraq war. But this feels a lot like we're just trying to degrade degrade Russia in the same way that we did when we were back in the Afghans back in the day. And I wonder, I mean, there's a literal battalion. People can obfuscate this all they want, but there's a literal battalion of Nazis in the Ukrainian military. That should be concerning to people, I think. But are we creating another state sponsor of terror up there like we did in Afghanistan in the 1970s and 80s? It seems insane to me that we're even engaged in this same exact behavior that we're always engaged in. And again, without any real congressional approval. I mean, they've approved some funding over there, but the president doesn't have the authority to tell Ukraine they can use offensive weapons against Russia.
They just did this week.
They just did. 100% they did. And it didn't go
but
well.
Look at how this was started up also. This was a case, it was like the Balkan Wars in Bosnia. This was the tail wagging dog. This was the Europeans saying, well, we can't, this is our neighbor that's under attack and we can't do anything about it. Let's drag the Americans in. So this was not a threat to NATO, or not a clear and present danger, at least to NATO. It was just Russia making its second invasion in a few years of Ukraine. So it invaded Ukraine in 2014 and then again in 2022. But it was the Europeans that were dragging us into it, mainly the Brits, once again, with Boris Johnson, and a couple of other smaller NATO powers. And the U.S. had no strategy except to expose, to publicize intelligence on what Russia was doing. But you had just had the Zapad war games, huge war games inside Russia, September prior to the invasion, and then you had nothing but bluster coming from a very befuddled Joe Biden, who had just had that disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan in August, but no real deterrence of Ukraine and of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. In fact, you had the Biden administration say that Russia was likely to take over Kiev in 3 to 4 days, maybe a week. And so the Biden administration was urging, close down the United States embassy in Kiev, encourage all the other countries to close down their embassies in Kiev and move them to another city westward, but also to encourage the Zelensky government to flee its own capital. So what the Biden administration was telling Putin, whether it wanted to or not, was, we're creating a free fire zone for you in Kiev where there will be no collateral damage against any NATO embassy or against any diplomatic site of any country where we have a mutual defense commitment. So that was a green light for Putin to invade. And then no strategy to help Ukraine resist. Why wouldn't Putin try to walk in like that the way he did?
I also seem to recall Biden saying something to the effect of, when he was asked by the press what would be a red line in the sand for U.S. involvement in the Ukraine-Russia situation, because, again, there was a lot of chatter going on about it, that large war game right on the border. Belarus was involved as well. It's like, I seem to recall Biden saying that, I can't remember the exact phrase he used, like a minor incursion wouldn't be a red line in the sand for us. Why the fuck would you say that out loud? Even if that's the truth, why would you ever say that? I don't understand why you would say that. I mean, I know why he said it, is because he has vascular dementia. But why would people that are clearly in charge of him, Ron Klain, I believe at the time, would allow this muppet to say that shit out loud?
Right. So really, it would be understandable, let's say not justifiable, but understandable. Okay, the Americans are cautiously giving a green light for Putin to go in and complete his 2014 invasion of Ukraine. And so that enters the Russian calculus. Okay, the U.S. won't respond if we do this, so therefore we're going to do this. And then, of course, the United States reacts the way it did with the NATO allies. So this is bad intelligence that we had, because the Russians could not have taken over Kiev in 3 to 4 days to a week. In fact, that was listening to Russian intercepts of Russian military intercepts about what they thought that they could do. So we had bad intelligence, we had bad diplomacy, we had bad strategic advice to the president and his entire team, and no contrarian advice was welcome. So then where are we now, 2.5 years later? And where are we headed?
My God. Here's Russian calculus. I like that phrase. So here's a math problem for you. George W. Bush, Georgia invasion. Obama, Crimea invasion. Biden, Ukraine invasion. Trump, Russian asset. Do that math for me. How's that
Yeah,
work?
it doesn't add up at all. So you had the same people who were accusing Trump of being a Russian asset. This was the Clinton campaign that created that whole narrative that then, got FBI Crossfire Hurricane going. It's really the only major counterintelligence operation the FBI has run that anybody knows of over the past decade was the fake one, Crossfire Hurricane. But you just think of it. The Hillary Clinton campaign and those around her were the very ones profiting from financial relationships with the Russian government and with Russian oligarchs around Putin. Whether it was the Clinton Foundation or Bill Clinton going to Moscow and being paid hundreds of $1,000s from that Putin-aligned bank just to give a little talk, or whether it was the Uranium One and a whole range of other things. They were fine with Putin until such time as they were not fine with Putin, and they're the ones calling Trump a Putin asset.
My supposition is that I think follow the money is a good idea. I think that at the root, I mean, you can try to dig into conspiratorial ideologies all you want, but the useful idiots, as it were, are typically going to be involved in the money part of it, right? The people that are being leveraged are typically there's true believers here and there that get people that get captured by the ideology, but I think the primary vein in all of this is going to be money. And I think that, as such, my supposition is that Trump wasn't a player in the military-industrial complex game, and that's why they come after him so hard. I don't think it has anything to do with anything else.
Right. He had no relations with anybody in the military-industrial complex or the Uniparty, for that matter. He had none with the intelligence community, and he's coming in saying, "I'm going to clean up this corrupt mess." Whether or not he could do it was another matter, but he was rallying a big portion of the public to come in and do precisely that. And if you go to the Washington, D.C. area, you'll see 6 of the 20 wealthiest counties in America are in the Washington, D.C. area, an area that has no indigenous industry, doesn't have its own banking industry, its own mining industry, its own manufacturing base. It has nothing that's not dependent on the central government that comes from the taxpayers. So that's the business model. So to keep that business model of building wealth through government service and building all your credentials and your contacts and ideas at taxpayer expense all your life, in or out of uniform, with the express goal of retiring from government services with your taxpayer-funded security clearances to go in and make now $500,000, $1 million, $10 million a year as either a contractor or an owner of or a partner in a government contracting enterprise. That's the whole business model, and Trump disrupted that idea.
Yeah, and it's I've said this for many, many years, but the aristocracy, the patricians, whatever you want to call them, they're going to protect the institution before they protect any particular ideology or person. They'll sacrifice people. They'll go against their own moral standards as long as it protects the institution, because otherwise, I mean, I think they know otherwise it's all going to rain down on their heads. And now people know all the scandals, man. I mean, it's the FBI targeting the Trump campaign under Obama's orders, and then continuing to work against him throughout his own presidency, which is, I don't know if that's ever happened before. Now, to be fair, Hoover worked against everybody except for himself when he was in power there. He was a lunatic, but I don't know that any president since the FBI moved on from Hoover had been specifically targeted. Maybe Nixon to some degree. They kind of fucked him over a little bit, but worked
They
against
overthrew
they yeah. I mean, I don't think people talk about that one enough. Like, Watergate was not a big enough deal for a president to resign. I mean, that's crazy to me that happened. But anyways, not what we're talking about here. But we all know about the intelligence community censoring people. DHS literally tried to stand up a Big Brother organization called the Disinformation Governance Board, I believe. Lying, the intelligence community penning letters lying about Russia, lying about Hunter Biden. Is there any chance, let's say Trump gets elected in November, is there any chance that the DOJ or the intelligence community actually get reformed, or is that a pipe dream?
Well, if you look at the campaign contributions coming from DOJ, according to the Federal Elections Commission, you'll find that 97% of DOJ employees who give political contributions give to the Democrat Party and Democrat candidates. That is not a sign that you could simply reform DOJ by a few people on top. You have a very politicized Department of Justice, like so much of the rest of the bureaucracy. And it's not just that they vote a certain way, but they become so militant about it and protecting their piece of the pie. Now you have, though, an extremely politicized FBI that in big intel, so I got a lot in here going back historically. J. Edgar Hoover never had the power that today's FBI has. And for as terrible things he did as FBI director in his 48 years, he was never as powerful and as abusive as the FBI is today. And he never had the power to go after the individual citizen the way the FBI has today. So it's a far more dangerous creature. There was no big tech for the FBI to merge with back when Hoover was around. So it's become something that is now a state within a state, the FBI. There's no way to go after it. Republicans really don't dare to go after it beyond ask tough questions when the FBI director comes up to testify. But they can't even defund FBI headquarters because the FBI legitimately needs a new, more modern headquarters building if you're going to keep it as that organization. But they don't even dare to do a whole lot to go after the Bureau or its budget. It's a bloated organization. It has a lot of useless positions. It has mission creep. It's completely overstepping its authority. And it is it has nothing but contempt for legislative oversight, which is part of the Constitution. And it's become grossly politicized. So even though the Republicans in Congress know that, now they haven't even taken steps to do this. And really, if you look at Donald Trump, he's the one who put Christopher Wray in office. He let the FBI run itself under a weak beltway lawyer like Christopher Wray, who made his money off the taxpayer as a beltway lawyer, and then went in and out of the revolving door of government to finally become FBI director. He let the CIA run itself. He put the Obama generals, he kept them in charge of the Pentagon and promoted them. So he went into office last time around not prepared for any of these challenges. This time around, he's much wiser, and he's got real teams of people who he's actually listening to, who have come forward with plans to implement through executive order and mock legislation day one as soon as he's president. So that's the only way it can be fixed, is by the president undoing executive orders and then getting certain laws pushed through if he has a friendly Congress. But as I argue in Big Intel, the FBI was founded by a memorandum of a deputy attorney general. So it wasn't founded by an act of law.
Right.
So it can be unfounded by a memorandum from the Justice Department. We need many of the functions that the FBI performs, but we don't need the FBI as it is anymore.
Well, let me ask you this then. If you could remake the DOJ, what would you change about it now?
I would first have Congress repeal a lot of federal laws and return powers back to the states. You need a huge DOJ only because we have so many federal laws to enforce. So I would abolish a lot of positions in the DOJ where they are either not necessary or they're being abused by careerists, and there's no way to fire those careerists. If you abolish those positions, then those careerists lose their jobs in federal service, and then you pull their security clearances and everything else, so they can't take advantage of the system as contractors from the outside. For the DOJ itself, I'd also take pieces of the DOJ budget and provide it as block grants to smaller states to allow them to beef up their own state investigative and law enforcement services where they can't afford to otherwise, and where their lack of having good investigative and law enforcement services would harm other states, let's say for illegal immigration or fentanyl trafficking or child trafficking or that kind of stuff. But I would take the FBI and break it up into different parts. So you take the criminal division of the FBI and you move that over to the U.S. Marshal Service. You take the national security branch and you break that up into pieces. So you have a standing counterintelligence service all of its own, just to go after foreign spies, which the FBI doesn't do very well. I mean, most of the FBI's victories against foreign spies have been foreign spies who've either turned themselves in on their own, or some of our foreign allies like Britain and France and Israel and elsewhere who have actually told us, hey, you've got spies over here. We might want to check it out. That's where the big busts have come from. Even Robert Hanssen was unmasked because of a Russian who turned himself in, who was handling Hanssen as an agent. It wasn't because of FBI sleuthing, because the FBI was not, it refused to believe that it could be infiltrated by the Russians.
And Hanssen was operational for a while. I mean,
a long time.
For a very long time. Yeah. You know what we learned from over the past couple years from Twitter and Google and Meta is that you can fire 12 or 15,000 people and have absolutely no change in the service you provide. If it's true for these tech companies that are run by smarter people than are in government, frankly, it's certainly true of government. I mean, I remember when I worked at DHS, my boss told me this is how it works. Congress in a committee says we need to do X for this next fiscal year. And then OPM says, okay, well, you need 4 people to do X. I'm like, all right, cool. So we hire 4 people. 2 or at least 2 of them are idiots. They'll never be good at anything in their life. So now you go through that fiscal year. That person serves for a full year, and because of the Federal Employees Union, it's impossible to fire them at that point without some kind of cause, and incompetence apparently is not a cause to fire people. So what do? You go back out and you hire 2 more people because apparently it takes 6 and not 4, right? And so on and on goes this thing of ours, as the Cosa Nostra likes to say. It is the dumbest shit I've ever witnessed in my life. I spent 1 year there. I'm like, nah, man, I got to get the hell out of here. This is retarded. I cannot participate in it. I never felt more useless than working for the government and standing around and looking at everybody else not doing anything either. I'm like, this is fucking crazy. Like, what are we doing here?
And imagine these retarded people, right, getting $140, $170 a year job plus pennies anywhere else in the private sector. Man. It's just not going to happen.
Now, what about the intelligence community? How do we reform that? Is there any way to do that? Because everybody I know that isn't a crazy leftist has left the agency and the NSA. Well, that's not true. I've got some friends left at NSA because they like tech work, right? But
there are still some there who are mission oriented, who are they're near their retirement or whatever.
Yeah.
And there's
a lot of people in AI at NSA too that are doing really interesting work. But the agency itself is, I don't know anybody that is doing anything over there other than like ground and maritime branch dudes who are also trying to get the fuck out because they don't want to be involved in that shit anymore.
Yeah. Well, first, it's a bloated bureaucracy. Let's look at just the CIA. It's huge. And the hugeness of the CIA becomes more apparent when you think there are only about 1,000 to 1,500 actual CIA officers.
Like COs,
abroad. Yeah. Only 1,000 to 1,500 out of that whole, 30,000 plus. So what are the rest of them?
That would be like the NYPD having 1,500 cops out of their 35,000 employees, and everybody else is just admin. I mean, it's fucking nuts, man.
Yeah. Now, you do need analysts. You do need linguists. Okay, and that's all right. That's fine. But do you need secret intelligence to spy on the climate? Do you need a whole network of agency resource groups for LGBTQI P plus, whatever they're calling it now? Do we really need that? Do you need to put DEI into every analytical product so you're tainting independent objective analysis by inserting ideological criteria into what's being evaluated to hand to the President of the United States and the rest of the national leadership so they can know what's happening in the world? Do you need that stuff?
I would say if you're doing a workup on a particular geopolitical issue, you don't need to have a couple of paragraphs in it about how it affects black trans people in California, probably, right? Like that seems like a non sequitur, frankly. How does it affect the country as a whole? And then we can move on from there.
Exactly. Now, so you have all, and then other things too. We really don't need intelligence capabilities in certain areas that are not of a vital interest to us. You can have just regular embassy reporting work on that. So, and we have these liaison relationships with other countries where we've become so dependent on whether it's the Saudis or the Israelis or the French or you name the country. We're so dependent on them that they produce our intelligence for us that we don't really independently evaluate. So then why do we have this whole bureaucracy if we're just depending in a really sad way on foreign countries to be providing intelligence for us that suits the purpose of those countries, not necessarily our own? So you slash a lot of that bloat, make these guys work a lot harder than they do, and return it back to merit pace. But also don't keep rotating people in and out of theater when they do go abroad, because they can't become the resident experts like the great powers have. So the Russians, the Chinese, the British, the French, and others, they'll have the same people in the same location, building their networks, even over a matter of generations, so that they've embedded in societies that are in their country's respective vital interests. We don't do that.
Yeah, so much for trust but verify first. And then second, we don't have an alien program, which is like the SVR is still very much a thing. I don't know why, I don't, militarily speaking, Russia is nothing to us, right? But that's not what they do. Since for about 100 years, they've been controlling quite a few geopolitical events just by doing what you described right there, which is low impact. Very often it's low risk as well, right? It just requires commitment over time. And that's a problem when we change power every 4 years, frankly, right? It's always going to be a problem for us. But, interestingly enough, this is one of the issues that the Middle Roman Empire ran into. They tried all sorts of different ways to figure out who the next emperor was going to be. They had one situation where it was 4 guys were going to rule at once, and that lasted once, and they're like, fuck no, that's stupid. And then 2 years later, they got rid of all those people. The line of succession for power in any empire is very important. It's important how we go about that, right? And the Romans never could figure it out. They never could figure it out, and that's why the empire ended. Because it's kind of like Game of Thrones with the Targaryens. Like, you flip a coin, and it's either a good person or a lunatic, right? You never know what's going to happen. And in our case, it's not very different. So I don't know how we're going to figure that out. I mean, the only way I can think of is for people to do what Plato said and take part in your own governance. Otherwise, you're doomed to be ruled by fools, right? We like to be on autopilot quite a bit. But back to the book, big intel, how the CIA and FBI went from Cold War heroes to deep state villains. We got to get out of here, but summarize it for me and tell people what they're going to learn from reading this thing.
Well, basically, we had institutions that generally had the American national interest in mind, regardless of party, regardless of mistakes that they made. They were essential to our own national security as a nation and to fighting crime in the case of the FBI. Their abuses notwithstanding. What happened was that a foreign adversary, in this case the Soviets, had supported a long-term, multi-generational active measures operation to subvert, undermine, and ultimately take over our institutions through their own ideology. And this was critical theory, like where we get critical race theory and critical gender theory, but also critical law theory, which is taught through most law schools now, that the law is not to be based on the Constitution. It is to be manipulated to serve a predetermined ideological end state. So when you have intelligence that's been corrupted to serve a preconceived ideological end state, and the rules of evidence and legal procedure and due process, in the case of DOJ and the FBI, to be manipulated for a certain end state, you can see where we are today with two-tier justices, with a politicized FBI and DOJ. So then you have now the undermining of the very frontline agencies that were set up to defend our constitutional government from being undermined. They have now become the underminers.
And where is that going to take us if we don't correct it?
If we don't correct it, we're doomed as a country.
Well, that's good news. So read the book. Maybe we can figure out how to correct it.
The last 2 chapters talk about correcting it.
Yeah, good. So don't spoil it. Go read the fucking book, you lazy bastards. Charles Constant reads it. He's a good narrator. Big Intel, how the CIA went from Cold War heroes to deep state villains. Dr. J. Michael Waller, thank you for your time today. This has been fascinating.
Been a lot of fun.
Thank you for coming again, and thank you all for listening. This has been Citizen.